The night sky above Cathara Prime flashed with warning signals. Again and again, red lights pulsed across crystalline towers that had stood for 10,000 years. General Kilthara pressed her hand against the war room's viewing crystal, watching. Another colony ship burned to nothing. How many this time, she asked, though she didn't want to know. 2 million, General. Gone in minutes. Officer Vexta's voice cracked through the translator. The shadow swarm consumed everything. Ships, stations, even the orbital gardens. Kilthara closed her eyes. In 3 months, they'd lost 40% of their people. The Catharian Alliance, once proud and peaceful, was dying a slow death. Their weapons barely tickled these ancient things that crawled through space like living nightmares. What about the Fourth Fleet? Can they hold the Petra system? They're trying, General, but... Vexta showed her the tactical display. Red dots, thousands of them, moved toward their positions like a spreading infection. The swarm adapts too, quickly. Every weapon we use they counter within hours. An aide rushed in, scales bright with fear. General, the archives team found something. They say it might help. Kilthara followed him down spiraling corridors to the oldest part of their city. Here, ancient crystals held memories from the time of their ancestors. Elder Zarkath, bent with age, gestured to a glowing pattern in the air. This memory comes from the deep past, General. Before even we learned to travel the stars. The old one's eyes were wide. It speaks of the shadow swarm's last awakening. How they were stopped. Tell me. A species from beyond the rim. From what they called a death world. The recording is broken, but it speaks of beings who fought with madness. Who charged into certain death and won. Kilthara stared at the fractured images. Creatures that looked soft, fragile. Pink skin. No natural weapons, tiny by galactic standards. But they moved with purpose that defied logic. Death world? She'd heard the term. Planet so violent that anything surviving there became something different. The translation is unclear, General. But they called themselves something. In the old tongue, it sounds like humans. Back in the war room, Kilthara faced her council. Every face showed the same hopeless expression. We could try reaching them, suggested Science Officer Moldai. If they still exist, if they remember. They haven't reached transgalactic travel, argued Defense Coordinator Thexrin. What could primitives do that we cannot? Kilthara looked at the tactical display again. More red was spreading. Soon their homeworld would be the only light left. Send the signal, she said quietly. General, send it. The message burned. Through space on their most powerful transmitters. Mathematics, physics, desperate images of destruction. A simple plea that transcended language. Help us. We are dying. Far away, on a small blue world, Luna Base picked up the signal. Admiral Sang-Ho stared at the screens as his communications team worked to decode the transmission. Sir, this is... They're under attack. Massive casualties. They're asking for help. Sang-Ho studied the broken images. An entire alliance of species facing extinction. He thought of his own daughter, safe on Earth. What if someone needed her help one day? The Council will refuse, warned Captain Yujin. We're barely holding our own colonies together. Then we don't ask the Council. The room fell silent. Yujin stepped forward. Sir? Put out the call. Volunteers only. Anyone willing to answer a stranger's cry for help. Sir, that's not how... Captain. Sang-Ho's voice carried the weight of command. My grandfather fought in the water wars. He used to say something. We don't choose our battles, but we can choose to fight them. Within hours, response signals flooded in. The mining ships from Ceres, transport vessels from Titan, even civilian craft with hastily mounted weapons. They came not because they had to, but because someone needed help. As the first human fleet prepared to launch, engineer Min Jun looked at his ragtag crew. Dock workers, miners, mechanics. Not soldiers, but people willing to try. Think we're crazy, Doc? He asked the ship's medic, a young woman named Jiwoo. She looked out at the void, knowing they might never return. Maybe. But maybe crazy is what they need. The ships lifted off, carrying Earth's answer to a desperate plea. They didn't know what they'd find. They didn't know if they could win. But they knew one thing for certain. Someone had called for help. And humanity always answered. Behind them, Earth's leaders argued and demanded explanations. Ahead lay the unknown. But somewhere in the darkness between stars, hope traveled at light speed, carried by those who couldn't say no to a stranger's tears. The shadow swarm had awakened after millennia of slumber. Soon, they would learn what happens when humanity hears someone scream for help. The hyperspace tunnel collapsed behind them with a sound like breaking glass. Admiral Sang-Ho watched the Catharian system appear on their screens, and his blood ran cold. Where star charts showed 3 inhabited, worlds only 1 still glowed. The others were dark, covered in something that looked like infection. Jesus, whispered Captain Eugene. What did that to them? Before anyone could answer, black shapes moved between the planets. Ships, if you could call them that, more like living metal that flowed and twisted as it moved. The shadow swarm. Admiral, receiving transmission from, well, I think it's the planet, reported Communications Officer Su Young. The hologram flickered to life. A tall, crystal-like being appeared, cracks running through her translucent body. When she spoke, her voice carried exhaustion that ran deeper than words. You came? Kilthera stared at them in disbelief. But your ships are so small. Commander Minhun looked at his crew. Miners from the asteroid belt. Dock workers from Mars Station. A med student who'd never seen combat. Not exactly the heroes anyone expected. We brought what we have, Eugene replied simply. I don't understand. Your weapons, your armor, they look primitive. How can you fight the shadow swarm with such equipment? Sergeant Dong Hyun, a former security guard from New Seoul, stepped forward. Ma'am, sometimes it's not about the gear, it's about who's using it. The Catharian general's face showed something like hope. Show me. An hour later, human. Dropships screamed toward the infected surface. Inside one, Private Jiwoo checked her equipment. Standard body armor, an old assault rifle, and enough explosives to level a city block. Remember the plan, shouted Lieutenant Gang Min over the engine noise. We hit hard, we hit fast, and we don't stop moving. What if we die? Asked Haewon, barely out of basic training. Then we die loud, Jiwoo grinned. The Catharians watched these strange creatures prepare for battle. No ceremony, no prayers to ancestors. Just jokes and nervous laughter as they checked weapons that looked like toys compared to galactic standards. They're insane, muttered a crystal warrior. Good, replied his commander. Maybe insane is what we need. The first assault hit like a sledgehammer. Where Catharian forces moved with precision and formation, humans charged in screaming. Literally screaming. They found it helped to deal with the fear. Jiwoo kicked down a door to find a shadow, spawn the size of a tank. Instead of retreating, she smiled. Hey, ugly. Thanks for standing still. The thermal charge in her backpack detonated 6 seconds later. The explosion took out half the building, but it also created the first real breach in the alien defenses. Captain, Minhun's engineering team worked miracles with duct tape and swearing. They took Catharian energy weapons and somehow made them work with human targeting systems. They used ship parts to build new tools that no manual ever described. This should not work, protested scientist Mordain, watching a human technician wire human computers to alien power cells. Buddy, half the stuff we do shouldn't work, laughed technician Seo Jin. We make it work anyway. The shadow creatures had fought for millennia. They'd consumed entire civilizations, but they'd never met anything like humans before. These creatures seemed to get stronger when things got worse. During one battle, Marine Da-un found herself cut off from her squad. Surrounded by shadow spawn, she counted her remaining ammunition. 3 bullets. Well, she muttered, better make them count. She threw her rifle like a club, tackled the nearest enemy, and started punching. Somehow, she won. The Catharians couldn't understand it. Their data told them humans were weak, slow, fragile. But they watched these fragile beings punch holes through solid metal, with nothing but determination and improvised explosives. "How?" asked General Kilthera, as she watched Medic Kyung-suk drag 3 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire. "How do they keep fighting?" Admiral Sang-ho looked tired but determined. "We come from a world that tried to kill us for millions of years. We learned to fight back." The war changed tone. Where before it had been a slow retreat toward extinction, now it became a slugging match. The Shadow Swarm still held most of the system, but they were bleeding for every inch. Dr. So-young set up a field hospital using human methods that made Catharian healers wince. Crude but effective, she kept soldiers fighting who should have died days ago. "Your medicine is barbaric," complained a crystal healer. "Maybe," So-young shrugged, "but they're still breathing." As the weeks passed, something strange happened. The Catharians began adopting human tactics. They started swearing in human languages during battle. They learned to use improvised weapons. They started telling jokes while facing death. "You're changing us," Kilthera observed. "Good," replied Yujin. "Change means you're still alive to adapt." The Shadow Swarm felt it too. For the first time in eons, prey was becoming predators. These soft creatures from the death world brought something new, the absolute refusal to stay down. As human ships prepared for the next assault, makeshift flags flew from their hulls. Not official military banners, but symbols of home. A photo of Earth, a child's drawing, a lucky cap. They were miners and mechanics, students and station workers. They weren't professional soldiers. But when someone screamed for help across the void, they came running, and the universe started to notice. The first joint mission started with explosions, not from enemy fire, but from technician Dong-hyun trying to connect human weapons to Catharian power systems. "Oops," he muttered, wiping soot from his face. "Maybe I should read the manual first." Catharian engineer Vexta stared at the smoking equipment. "Your people don't use safety protocols?" "Sure we do," Dong-hyun grinned. "We call it learning from mistakes." An hour later, they had it working. Somehow. The Catharian weapons now fired human-made projectiles at twice their normal speed. It looked ugly, sounded terrible, and worked perfectly. Captain Yujin watched from the command center as mixed squads prepared for their first assault together. The Catharians moved like dancers, every motion precise and graceful. The humans stumbled around like friendly disasters, bumping into each other and laughing about it. "This will never work," worried General Kilthera. "Give them a chance," Yujin replied. "Sometimes the best teams are the strangest ones." The assault began at dawn. Catharian drop pods landed silently, depositing crystal warriors who took perfect, defensive positions. Human transports came down like meteor strikes, doors flying open before they even stopped moving. "Go, go, go," yelled squad leader Haewon, charging out while the ship was still sliding across the ground. The shadow spawn were waiting, massive creatures that looked like mechanical spiders crossed with tentacled nightmares. They'd been fighting the same way for millennia, and they were good at it, but they'd never fought anything like this before. Private Jiwoo and Catharian warrior Zarketh worked together clearing a building. Where Zarketh used elegant sword work to slice through enemies, Jiwoo just tackled them and set off grenades. "That seems inefficient," Zarketh observed politely. "Maybe," Jiwoo panted, covered in alien guts, "but it's fun." The real breakthrough came when Corporal Min-jun figured out how to turn Catharian shield generators into weapons. Instead of protecting, they could now punch holes through solid walls. "The power settings are all wrong," protested scientist Mordain. "You'll burn out the crystals." "So?" Min-jun shrugged. "We'll make new ones." "You can't just make new crystals, they take centuries to grow." Min-jun held up a handful of synthetic crystals he'd made in the ship's workshop. "Want to bet?" The Catharians were learning too. Watching humans fight was like watching organized chaos. Nothing followed the rules, everything was improvised, and somehow it worked. During one battle, Sergeant Seo Jin found herself pinned down with a group of Catharian soldiers. The proper response was to call for backup and maintain position. "Hey," she called to her crystal allies, "want to try something stupid?" 5 minutes later, they were all running straight at the enemy while screaming at the top of their lungs. The shadow spawn, accustomed to orderly retreat or advance, were completely confused. "I don't understand," said one Catharian after the battle. "We should have died." "Maybe," Seojin grinned, "but we didn't. The war changed. Where before it was a slow grind toward extinction, now it became something else. The Shadow Swarm had to actually think about their moves instead of just overwhelming with numbers. Field medics so young set up combined aid stations where human doctors worked alongside Catharian healers. The methods were completely different, but they learned from each other. "Your healing crystals are incredible," So Young admitted, "but sometimes a good old-fashioned bandage works just as well." The Catharians were amazed by human medical techniques. They used tools that shouldn't work, performed procedures that broke every rule, and somehow kept people alive who should have died. "You heal like you fight," observed healer Kilthera, "with no regard for what's possible." "Exactly," So Young smiled. "Possible is overrated." The breakthrough came during the assault on the Shadow Hive at Kithera's moon. The building was massive, biometallic, and seemingly impossible to breach. Traditional weapons barely scratched its surface. "We need something bigger," said Captain Gangmin. "No," replied Lieutenant Hei Wan, studying the structure. "We need something stupider." Her plan was insane. They would use a damaged Catharian ship as a ram, filled with human explosives and Catharian power cores. Someone had to stay behind to guide it in. "I'll do it," volunteered pilot Dayun. "Me too," added engineer Minhui. "And me," said Catharian navigator Vexta. They looked at each other in surprise. Somewhere along the way, the crystal being had started thinking like a human. The ramming run lit up the sky. The ship exploded against the hive like a miniature star. For a moment, everyone thought it had failed. Then the entire structure began to collapse. "Impossible," whispered a shadow spawn, its voice caught by human translators. It was the first time anyone had heard them speak. "Nothing's impossible," came a voice from the wreckage. Dayun crawled out, battered but grinning. "Just really, really difficult." From that day forward, the Shadow Swarm stopped treating humans as just another food source. They began to retreat from battles they could still win, pulling back to reassess. "We've never made them retreat before," General Kilthera observed. "That's because you've been thinking like prey," Admiral Sangho replied. "These things have been apex predators for millions of years. They've forgotten what it's like to face something that thinks they're the prey." The war was far from over. But for the first time in months, the Catharians felt something they'd almost forgotten. Hope. And in the dark between stars, ancient creatures that had consumed galaxies were learning a new word from human radio chatter. Uh-oh. 6 months into the war, everything had changed. The Catharian alliance had gone from a dying civilization to something that scared even the Shadow Swarm. And it was all because humans refused to follow the rules of war. "This makes no sense," protested Catharian war scholar Zarketh, watching a tactical display. "Your plans violate every principle of combat known to civilized space." "Good," replied Staff Sergeant Heiwan, marking another target. "If we followed the rules, we'd be dead." The humans had taught their allies something revolutionary. War wasn't supposed to be fair. Captain Gang Min's engineering team had become legends throughout the Alliance. They took beautiful Catharian warships and turned them into flying nightmares. Where crystal technology provided elegant solutions, humans added guns. Lots of guns. "You put weapons on our medical ships," Healer Kilthera mentioned, sounding more curious than angry. "Yep," nodded Engineer Minjun. "Now they're medical ships with teeth." "But isn't that against galactic conventions?" "Probably," Minjun shrugged. "But the Shadow Swarm doesn't follow conventions either. The real change came when humans introduced the concept of psychological warfare to their crystal allies. Before, battles were straightforward. Shoot, take cover, advance or retreat. Humans made it weird. Lieutenant Seo Jin started broadcasting Earth music during attacks, heavy metal specifically. The shadow creatures had never experienced anything like it. "What is this noise?" a captured spawn had screamed through the translators. That's Metallica, buddy, Seojin grinned. Gets better once you appreciate the artistic complexity. But music was just the beginning. Humans introduced trash talk to galactic warfare. "Hey, you ugly piece of space junk," shouted Private Jiwoo over the comm during a space battle. "My grandmother hits harder than you, and she's been dead for 20 years. The Catharians watched in fascination as Shadowspawn actually flinched at the insults. These ancient predators had never been mocked before. They didn't know how to handle it. Dr. So Young revolutionized battlefield medicine by combining human practical knowledge with Catharian crystals. She created healing stations that worked twice as fast as traditional methods." "How?" asked Catharian healer Vexta, watching humans recover from wounds that should have been fatal. "Spite, mostly," So Young replied, checking a patient's vitals. "Humans are too stubborn to die properly. The war evolved in ways no one expected. Where the Shadow Swarm adapted slowly over centuries, humans changed tactics daily, sometimes hourly. Commander Yujin implemented Operation Crazy Train, a plan where human and Catharian ships would ram enemy vessels, teleport their crews away at the last second, then explode. It was wasteful, dangerous, and completely unpredictable. "This is madness," observed General Kilthera. "Yeah," Yujin grinned, "but it's our madness. The psychological impact was incredible." Shadow Spawn started hesitating before engaging human forces. Ancient creatures that had consumed galaxies began showing something they'd never displayed before: uncertainty. Pilot Da-Un specialized in impossible maneuvers. She'd fly her fighter backwards while shooting forward, perform loops inside asteroid fields, and once successfully landed on a shadow ship while it was doing evasive maneuvers. "Physics should prevent those flight patterns," complained Catharian Navigation Officer Mordain. "Physics is more like guidelines," Da-Un replied, pulling a barrel roll that made 3 Catharians throw up. The humans also introduced something the galaxy had never seen: learning from enemies. They studied captured shadow technology, reverse-engineered it, and made it better. Engineer Kyung-soo created hybrid weapons that combined shadow biotech with human engineering and Catharian crystals. The results looked like something from a nightmare, but they worked beautifully. "These weapons have no elegance," sighed Catharian weapon master Zarketh. "Elegance doesn't kill the bad guys," Kyung-soo replied. "This does. The biggest change came in how battles were fought. Humans taught their allies that winning wasn't about honor or tradition, it was about going home alive. During the Battle of the Seventh Moon, Sergeant Dong-hyun used garbage as a weapon. Literally, his squad loaded a mass driver with compressed trash and fired it at enemy formations. "That's not ammunition," protested a Catharian officer. "It is now," Dong-hyun grinned, watching Shadow Spawn get pelted with high-velocity debris. The war became a contest of adaptation. Where the Shadow Swarm expected galactic warfare to follow ancient patterns, humans kept changing the rules. They fought in ways that had never been tried before. Lieutenant Colonel Gang Min pioneered emotional warfare. Human ships would broadcast recorded messages from Catharian families thanking their warriors for fighting. The psychological boost was enormous. "Your species is strange," General Kilthera observed. "You fight not just with weapons, but with feelings." "Everything's a weapon if you use it right," Gangmin replied. The Shadow Swarm began to change their tactics too. But where they adapted to counter specific strategies, humans had moved on to completely different approaches. "They're learning from us," worried tactician Zarketh. "Good," replied Admiral Sangho. "That means they're not learning from each other." The war had become something unprecedented. Ancient predators were being out-evolved by creatures who used chaos as strategy. The Catharians, caught between these two forces, found themselves becoming something new. "We're not the same people who asked for help," Kilthera mentioned during a strategy meeting. "Neither are we," admitted Captain Yujin. "That's how survival works." As the battles raged across the system, one thing became clear. The universe was witnessing the birth of something new. Not just a military alliance, but a completely different approach to war itself. And in the darkness between stars, the shadow swarm was learning a terrifying truth. Sometimes the prey hunts back. The final battle began with a silence that felt wrong. Above Kithra Prime, the shadow swarm gathered in numbers that blotted out the stars. Every ship they'd ever built, every nightmare they'd ever spawned, all focused on one dying world. "Sir," whispered Communications Officer Su Young, "I'm reading over 2 million vessels, maybe more." Admiral Sang Ho looked at their own forces. 800 human ships, 1,000 Catharian vessels, all that remained after months of brutal fighting. "Well," he said quietly, "at least we'll go out with style." General Kilthera stood beside him, her crystal body showing stress fractures that would never heal. "Is there any other way?" "There's always another way," replied Sang Ho. He turned to his staff. "Execute Protocol Zero." The room went silent. Protocol Zero was humanity's last resort. It meant using their own ships as weapons, turning every vessel into a guided missile. "Sir," Captain Yu Jin spoke carefully. "That means, I know what it means." Commander Minjun's engineering team worked like people possessed. They rigged every human ship with modified fusion drives, turning them into massive bombs. The Catharians watched in horrified admiration. "You're all insane," breathed scientist Mordain. "Probably," agreed engineer Kyung-soo, wiring an explosive to his own ship's power core. "But we're insane together." The plan was simple in its madness. The human fleet would charge straight at the Shadow Queen ship, the massive vessel at the center of the swarm. They'd ram it, board it, and detonate every weapon they had inside the creature's core. "Who volunteers for the boarding party?" asked Yu Jin. Every human raised their hand. Every single one. "I'll come too," said Catharian warrior Zarketh. "Someone needs to make sure you do it properly." Soon, crystal beings throughout the fleet were volunteering. They'd learned from humans that some things were worth dying for. Lieutenant Daun ran final checks on her fighter. She'd be leading the first wave, clearing a path through the shadow defenders. Her hands shook slightly as she sealed her helmet. "Scared?" asked pilot Gangmin. "Terrified," Daun replied. "You?" "Same." They shared a look that said everything. Fear was normal. Cowardice was not. The attack began at 14 Auk ship time. Human and Catharian vessels charged in a ragged line toward impossible odds. The shadow swarm moved to meet them, confident in their overwhelming numbers. They were wrong. The humans had one last trick. As they approached, every ship began broadcasting, not tactical data or warnings. They broadcast messages home. "Hi, Mom," said Private Jiwoo over open comm. "If you're getting this, we won. Tell Dad his weird chili recipe was actually pretty good." "Sarah," transmitted Commander Minhu, "remember what I said about the garden? Plant those roses. They'll be beautiful in spring." The messages flooded the channels. Love, jokes, final words, shopping lists, inside jokes between siblings. 1,000 personal notes home from people who knew they'd never see Earth again. The Catharians added their own voices, crystal harmonics that sounded like music mixed with human words and laughter. The shadow swarm hesitated. They'd never experienced anything like this. These creatures were charging to their deaths, and they were happy? "What are you doing?" screamed a shadow creature, its voice translated roughly. "Saying goodbye," replied Sergeant Seojin. "You wouldn't understand." The first wave hit like a meteor shower. Human fighters weaved between shadow defenders, taking terrible losses but clearing a path. Daun's ship took a direct hit that sheared off half her wing. "Still flying," she announced, spinning her fighter like a wounded bird toward a shadow cruiser. Her fusion drive exploded 5 seconds later, taking 3 enemy ships with her. The second wave followed. Larger ships moving slower but hitting harder. The Soul's Pride led the charge, her hull scarred from a dozen battles. Admiral Sang Ho stood on the bridge, watching their target grow larger. "All hands," he broadcast to the fleet. "This is the Admiral. Today we end this war. Not because we have to, but because someone has to. The Shadow Queen ship was enormous, a living vessel that had destroyed civilizations. Inside its biomechanical halls, shadow spawn gathered to repel boarders. They were used to prey that ran, not prey that knocked on the door. Commander Min-ho led the boarding party. 200 humans and Catharians, armed with everything they could carry. They punched through the Queen ship's hull like bullets, screaming their way into the belly of the beast. "Remember the plan," shouted Min-ho, shooting shadow spawn with a weapon that looked like a crystal rifle duct-taped to a human shotgun. 10 minutes to the core. They fought room by room, corridor by corridor, losing people at every corner. Medic So Young worked frantically, keeping wounded soldiers in the fight. "Doctor," gasped Lieutenant Haewon, her leg mangled by shadow claws. "How bad?" "You'll live." So Young lied gently, knowing the truth. The human ships rammed the Queen one by one. The Inchen's wrath, the new soul, the Earth's answer. Each impact shook the massive vessel like an earthquake. Inside, the boarding party reached the core, a pulsing heart of biomechanical horror that controlled the entire swarm. Catharian engineer Zarketh stared at it in awe. "Magnificent," he whispered. "And terrible." "Yeah," agreed Sergeant Dong-hyun, setting charges. "Kill it anyway." They had minutes before the final ships arrived. Admiral Sang-ho's soul's pride was the last, screaming toward the Queen at full speed. "This is it," Min-ho announced on the comm. Everyone together? Human and Catharian voices answered as one. Together. The explosions came like thunder. Every charge, every ship, every sacrifice happening at once. The Shadow Queen screamed, a sound that echoed across dimensions. Reality itself seemed to crack as millions of years of accumulated malevolence died in nuclear fire. The silence that followed was deafening. 3 days later, the rescue ships found survivors in the wreckage. Commander Yu-jin floated unconscious in an escape pod. Dr. So Young was found drifting near the remains of her medical ship, still tending to wounded. Lieutenant Seo-jin was discovered inside a shadow fighter she'd somehow commandeered. General Kilthara met them in the makeshift hospital. Her body was more cracked than crystal now, but she was alive. "How many?" asked Yu-jin. 47,000 human lives, Kilthara replied softly. 18,000 Catharian souls. Yu-jin closed her eyes. So many friends. So many heroes. "Was it worth it?" asked a young Catharian medic. Yu-jin looked at the medical bay filled with wounded from both species, human jokes mixed with Catharian harmony songs. People who'd been strangers a year ago now called each other family. "Ask them," she said, nodding toward the window. Outside, Cathara Prime was rebuilding. Children played in the streets, both human and crystal children. The memorial wall on Luna Base listed every name, 47,000 individual people who answered a call from strangers. The final entry, carved by consensus, read simply, "They died so others might live. They died so we might stand together. They died as friends." And in the depths of space, the few remaining shadow spawn fled toward dark corners of the universe. They carried with them a new fear, the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy lived creatures who would cross stars to help strangers, creatures who laughed at fear, creatures called human.